The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence House as Queen Camilla sat in her private study, surrounded by boxes of royal jewelry that had been brought up from the palace vaults. The weak October sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian rug where dozens of velvet cases lay scattered. Each box contained treasures that told the story of the British monarchy. But Camilla's attention was fixed on one particular case that remained unopened on her mahogany desk. Inside that case lay the Spencer family tiara, a piece that had become forever linked with Princess Diana. The delicate diamond and pearl creation had graced Diana's head on her wedding day in 1981, and again at countless state functions throughout her marriage to Charles. Now, more than 25 years after Diana's death, the tiara sat in darkness, waiting for a decision that would ripple through the royal family and beyond. Camilla picked up the case with trembling fingers. She had been queen for nearly 2 years now, ever since Charles's coronation, but she still felt the weight of comparison to his first wife. Diana's ghost seemed to haunt every corridor of every royal residence, her memory preserved in photographs, in the hearts of the public, and in the jewelry that she had once worn with such grace and dignity. The door to the study creaked open, and Lady Susan Hussey, one of the Queen's most trusted ladies-in-waiting, entered quietly. Susan had served the royal family for over 60 years, having been a close confidant to Queen Elizabeth II and now serving Camilla with the same dedication and discretion. "Your Majesty," Susan said softly, "the Prime Minister's wife will be arriving shortly for the charity luncheon. Perhaps we should select the jewelry for today's event." Camilla nodded absently, still staring at the case in her hands. "Susan, tell me honestly, do you think the public will ever truly accept me? Do you think they'll ever stop comparing me to her?" Lady Susan moved closer, her weathered face showing the compassion that came from decades of service to women who carried the burden of the crown. "Ma'am, you're the queen now. You have earned your place through years of dedication and service. The public's perception will change with time, as it always does." But Camilla wasn't convinced. She had spent years in Diana's shadow, first as the other woman who had allegedly broken up the fairy tale marriage, and now as the woman who had taken Diana's place. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every outfit analyzed, every piece of jewelry she wore examined for its significance and appropriateness. "Look at this," Camilla said, opening the case to reveal the Spencer tiara. The diamonds caught the dim light and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. She was so beautiful when she wore this. So young, so full of hope. The public loved her in a way they'll never love me. Lady Susan sat down in the chair across from Camilla's desk. "Your Majesty, if I may speak frankly, you are not Diana, nor should you try to be. You are your own person, with your own strengths and your own contributions to the monarchy. The comparison is unfair to both of you." Camilla closed the case and set it aside, reaching instead for a simpler set of pearl earrings. But her eyes kept drifting back to the Spencer tiara. There was something about it that called to her, perhaps because it represented everything she felt she could never have: the public's unqualified love and acceptance. The rain continued to fall as Camilla prepared for the charity luncheon. The event was in support of literacy programs for underprivileged children, a cause that had become particularly close to her heart. She had spent years working quietly behind the scenes to support various charities, but these efforts were often overshadowed by the continued fascination with Diana's legacy. As her dresser helped her into a navy blue dress suit, Camilla caught sight of herself in the mirror. At 76, she was elegant in her own way, but she could never escape the knowledge that Diana had been just 36 when she died, frozen in time as the young, beautiful princess who had captured the world's heart. "Your Majesty," her dresser said gently, "which jewelry would you prefer for today?" Camilla's eyes moved to the jewelry cases spread across her dressing table. There were magnificent pieces, emeralds that had belonged to Queen Mary, sapphires from the Queen Mother's collection, diamonds that sparkled with a history of centuries. But her gaze kept returning to that one case, the one containing Diana's tiara. "Tell me," Camilla said to her dresser, "what do you think the reaction would be if I wore the Spencer tiara today?" The dresser's hands paused in their work. It was an unusual question, and one that carried enormous implications. "Ma'am, that would be a very bold choice." Camilla studied her reflection. Perhaps it was time for a bold choice. Perhaps it was time to stop living in Diana's shadow and instead embrace the legacy that came with being queen. The Spencer tiara was, after all, part of the crown jewels now. It belonged to whoever held the title of queen consort. Lady Susan appeared in the doorway of the dressing room. "Your Majesty, the car is ready when you are." "Susan," Camilla said, turning from the mirror, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me your honest opinion." "Of course, ma'am. What would you think if I chose to wear Diana's tiara today?" The silence that followed was profound. Lady Susan's expression showed a mixture of surprise, concern, and something that might have been admiration for Camilla's courage in even considering such a move. "Your Majesty," Susan said carefully, "that would certainly make a statement. But are you prepared for the reaction it might provoke?" Camilla walked over to the case and opened it once more. The tiara seemed to glow in the afternoon light, its diamonds and pearls arranged in a pattern that had been crafted by the finest jewelers of the early 20th century. It had been in the Spencer family for generations before Diana wore it, and it would outlast them all. "I'm tired of tiptoeing around her memory," Camilla said with sudden determination. "I'm tired of feeling like an imposter in my own life. I am the queen now, and perhaps it's time I acted like it." She reached for the tiara, lifting it carefully from its velvet bed. The weight of it surprised her, not just the physical weight of the precious metals and stones, but the emotional weight of what it represented. This was Diana's tiara, the one she had worn with such joy and later with such sadness as her marriage crumbled. "Ma'am," Lady Susan said quietly, "might I suggest considering the timing? Today's event is for children's literacy. Perhaps a simpler choice might be more appropriate." But Camilla was no longer listening to reason. Something had awakened in her, a determination that had been building for years. She was tired of being the consolation prize, the woman Charles had settled for after Diana's death. She was tired of being seen as second best. "Help me put it on," she said to her dresser, who looked uncertainly at Lady Susan. "Your Majesty," Susan tried once more. "Perhaps we should discuss this with His Majesty first?" "Charles is at his morning meetings," Camilla replied firmly. "This is my decision to make." The dresser's hands shook slightly as she lifted the tiara and carefully placed it on Camilla's silver hair. The fit was perfect, as if it had been made for her. In the mirror, Camilla saw herself transformed. The tiara elevated her entire appearance, giving her a regal bearing that she had never quite achieved with other pieces. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to wear this in public, to see the shock on people's faces, to claim her rightful place as queen without apology or hesitation. But as she stared at her reflection, she began to see not herself, but Diana. The tiara carried such strong associations with the late princess that it seemed to conjure her presence. A knock on the door interrupted her reverie. "Your Majesty," came the voice of her private secretary. "The Prime Minister's wife has arrived. She's waiting in the blue drawing room." Camilla looked at herself one more time in the mirror. The tiara caught the light beautifully, but something felt wrong. Perhaps it was the weight of history, or perhaps it was the voice in her head that sounded remarkably like Diana, asking why she thought she had the right to wear something so personal, so tied to memories that weren't hers. "Take it off," she said suddenly. "Ma'am," her dresser asked. "Take it off. I've changed my mind." As the tiara was carefully removed from her head, Camilla felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. She had come so close to making a statement that would have reverberated throughout the monarchy and beyond. But perhaps Susan was right. Perhaps today wasn't the right day. She selected a simple strand of pearls instead, a safe choice that wouldn't generate headlines or controversy. As she fastened the clasp, she caught sight of the Spencer tiara being returned to its case. It seemed to be mocking her, challenging her to be brave enough to claim what was rightfully hers. The charity luncheon proceeded without incident. Camilla gave a heartfelt speech about the importance of literacy and education, and the Prime Minister's wife praised her commitment to the cause. But throughout the event, Camilla's thoughts kept returning to that tiara, sitting in its case back at Clarence House, waiting for someone brave enough to wear it. Later that evening, as Charles joined her for dinner in their private dining room, Camilla found herself studying her husband's face. He looked tired, the weight of kingship showing in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. At 75, he had waited longer than any heir in British history to take the throne, and the responsibility was taking its toll. "How was the literacy luncheon?" he asked, cutting into his salmon. "Fine," Camilla replied absently. "Charles, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever think about her jewelry?" "Diana's jewelry." Charles paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. It wasn't a subject they discussed often, though Diana's memory was never far from any conversation about the monarchy. "What about it?" "Well, it's all in the royal collection now. Technically, as queen, I could wear any of it." Charles set down his fork and looked at his wife carefully. "Camilla, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that I'm tired of living in her shadow. I'm thinking that maybe it's time I stop being apologetic about my place in this family." "What specifically are you considering?" Camilla met his gaze directly. "The Spencer tiara. I was thinking of wearing it to the state dinner next week." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Charles's expression shifted from surprise to concern to something that might have been fear. "Camilla," he said finally, "that would be inadvisable." "Why? Because people might talk?" "People always talk about me, Charles. They compare everything I do to what she did. At least this way, I'd be making the comparison on my own terms. It's not about what people might say. It's about respect for Diana's memory and respect for William and Harry. That tiara isn't just a piece of jewelry. It's a symbol of their mother." Camilla pushed her food around her plate, no longer hungry. "And what am I a symbol of? The other woman? The one who broke up the fairy tale?" "You're my wife," Charles said firmly. "You're the queen. That should be enough." But as Camilla looked at her husband, she knew it wasn't enough. Not for her, and perhaps not for the country she now served. The Spencer tiara represented something more than just diamonds and pearls. It represented acceptance, legitimacy, and the right to step out of Diana's shadow once and for all. As the evening wound down and they prepared for bed, Camilla made a decision. She would wear the tiara to the state dinner, regardless of Charles's concerns. It was time to claim her place in history, not as Diana's replacement, but as a queen in her own right. The consequences, whatever they might be, would be worth the statement she needed to make. The morning of the state dinner arrived with unprecedented activity at Buckingham Palace. Staff members hurried through the corridors, making final preparations for the evening's grand event honoring the President of France and his wife. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they gleamed, silverware was inspected for the slightest imperfection, and flowers were arranged with mathematical precision in the staterooms. Camilla had spent a restless night, her dreams filled with images of Diana wearing the Spencer tiara, smiling that radiant smile that had captivated the world. She woke with more determination than ever to follow through with her plan, despite Charles's obvious disapproval. As she lay in bed watching her husband dress for his morning appointments, she wondered if he had any idea what she was planning for the evening. "I'll be in meetings most of the day," Charles said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "The French delegation wants to discuss the new trade agreements before tonight's dinner." "Of course," Camilla replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I have my own preparations to make." After Charles left, Camilla summoned Lady Susan to her private sitting room. The older woman arrived carrying a tea service and wearing an expression that suggested she had spent the night worrying about their conversation from the previous day. "Your Majesty," Susan said, setting down the tea tray with particular care, "I've been thinking about our discussion yesterday, about the jewelry selection for tonight. And what conclusions have you reached?" Camilla asked, pouring herself a cup of Earl Grey. "I think you should reconsider. The Spencer tiara carries too much emotional weight, too much history. Tonight should be about diplomacy and strengthening relationships with France, not about making personal statements." Camilla sipped her tea thoughtfully. She had expected this resistance from Susan, just as she had expected Charles's concerns. But their caution only strengthened her resolve. For too long, She had allowed others to dictate how she should behave, what she should wear, how she should present herself to the world. Susan, may I ask you something? Do you think Queen Elizabeth would have hesitated to wear a piece from the royal collection simply because it had belonged to someone else? Lady Susan paused, clearly caught off guard by the question. Your Majesty, that's different. Queen Elizabeth inherited pieces that had been in the royal collection for generations. And now I have inherited pieces that Diana wore. They're part of the collection now, part of my inheritance as queen. But the emotional significance is exactly why I need to wear it, Camilla interrupted with unusual sharpness. I'm tired of tiptoeing around emotional significance. I'm tired of treating Diana's memory like a museum exhibit that can't be touched. Susan set down her teacup with a slight clink. Your Majesty, forgive me for speaking so directly, but I fear you may be underestimating the reaction this could provoke. The Spencer family, Prince William and Prince Harry, the press, the public, they may not understand your intentions. Then, perhaps it's time they learn to understand them, Camilla replied firmly. I've spent years trying to be respectful, trying to honor Diana's memory while carving out my own space. But respect and honor shouldn't require me to remain invisible. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Camilla's private secretary entered with a concerned expression. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been an unexpected development. Princess Anne has requested an urgent meeting with you this morning. Camilla felt her stomach tighten and was known for her directness and her fierce protection of the royal family's reputation. If she was requesting an urgent meeting, it likely meant she had heard something about Camilla's plans for the evening. Did she say what this was regarding? Camilla asked. She mentioned something about jewelry protocols for tonight's state dinner, Your Majesty. Lady Susan and Camilla exchanged glances. Somehow, word had leaked about the Spencer tiara. In the closed world of the royal household, secrets rarely stayed secret for long. Tell Princess, and I'll see her in my study in 20 minutes, Camilla said, and asked that we not be disturbed. After her secretary left, Susan leaned forward in her chair. Ma'am, perhaps this is a sign that you should reconsider. If Princess Anne has concerns about everything, Camilla replied, but she felt her confidence wavering slightly, and commanded enormous respect within the family, and had been one of the few royals to publicly support Camilla's marriage to Charles. If Anne was worried, perhaps there was good reason. 20 minutes later, Princess Anne entered Camilla's study with her characteristic brisk efficiency. At 73, she remained one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, known for her no-nonsense approach to everything from state duties to family matters. Camilla, and said without preamble, we need to talk about tonight. I assume this is about my choice of jewelry? Among other things, yes. And settled into the chair across from Camilla's desk, her posture perfectly erect despite her age. I understand you're considering wearing Diana's tiara to the state dinner. The Spencer tiara is now part of the crown jewels, Camilla replied carefully. As such, it's available for my use. Technically, yes. But we both know this isn't about technicalities. Anne's gray eyes were steady and uncompromising. This is about perception, about timing, and about the impact on the family. And, with respect, I've spent years worrying about perception and impact. Perhaps it's time I worried more about establishing my own identity as queen. Your identity as queen doesn't require you to appropriate Diana's most recognizable piece of jewelry, and said bluntly, especially not at a state dinner where every photographer in London will be present. Camilla felt heat rise in her cheeks. Appropriate? That's an interesting choice of words. It's an accurate choice of words. Diana wore that tiara at her wedding, at state functions, at some of the most photographed moments of her life. It's not just jewelry, it's iconography. And what am I supposed to do? Treat it like it's cursed? Lock it away forever because she wore it? And leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. I'm not suggesting you never wear it. I'm suggesting that tonight, with the French president and his wife present, with the international press watching, might not be the appropriate time to debut such a controversial choice. When would be the appropriate time? And when I'm dead and buried? When everyone has finally stopped comparing me to her? When enough time has passed that the gesture can be seen as honoring her memory rather than competing with it? The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on Camilla's desk. She could see the logic in Anne's argument, but logic wasn't driving her decision. She was driven by years of feeling like a secondary character in her own life, years of reading comparisons in the press, years of knowing that no matter what she did, some people would always see her as the woman who had come between Charles and Diana. And Camilla said finally, "Can I ask you something honestly? Do you think the public will ever truly accept me as queen?" Princess, and considered the question carefully. "I think the public accepts institutions more readily than individuals. They've accepted you as queen because that's what Charles needed, and they respect Charles as king. Your personal popularity is less important than your effectiveness in the role. But Diana's personal popularity was everything. People loved her in a way they've never loved me. Diana's popularity was also her burden," and replied quietly. "It created expectations she couldn't meet and pressures that ultimately contributed to the breakdown of her marriage. Be careful what you wish for." Camilla stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. The autumn flowers were still blooming, defiant in the face of the approaching winter. She felt a kinship with them, still trying to flourish despite the changing seasons. "I need to make a statement, and I need people to see me as more than just Charles's second choice. Then make it with your actions, not your jewelry. Make it with your charitable work, your dedication to your duties, your support for Charles. Don't make it with a piece of jewelry that will overshadow everything else you've accomplished." When Camilla turned back to face, and her sister-in-law was studying her with an expression that was both sympathetic and stern. "I know this has been difficult for you," and continued. "Being compared to Diana, living in her shadow, feeling like you have to prove yourself constantly. But wearing her tiara won't solve any of that. It will only create new problems. What if I don't care about new problems? What if I'm tired of being careful and diplomatic and constantly worrying about other people's feelings?" "Then you're not thinking like a queen," and said firmly. "Queens put duty before personal satisfaction. They put the institution before individual desires. That's the job you accepted when you married Charles." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Camilla had known when she married Charles that she would be taking on responsibilities that went far beyond being his wife. She had accepted that her personal desires would often come second to royal duties and public expectations. But acceptance and happiness were two different things, and she was tired of pretending she was happy living in Diana's shadow. After Anne left, Camilla found herself alone with her thoughts and the weight of the decision she still had to make. The Spencer tiara sat in its case in her dressing room, waiting for her choice. She could almost feel its presence, calling to her like a siren song. She spent the afternoon trying to focus on other things, reviewing her speech for the evening, approving the final details of the dinner arrangements, meeting with the head of palace security about protocols for the French delegation. But her mind kept wandering back to that tiara, to the statement it would make, to the liberation she imagined she would feel wearing it. As evening approached, and she began preparing for the state dinner, Camilla's dresser laid out several jewelry options on her dressing table. There were magnificent pieces, a sapphire parure that had belonged to Queen Mary, emeralds that had been a wedding gift from the Queen Mother, diamonds that sparkled with centuries of royal history. But Camilla's eyes kept returning to the case containing the Spencer tiara. "Your Majesty," her dresser said carefully, "which pieces would you prefer for this evening?" Camilla looked at her reflection in the mirror. She was wearing a midnight blue gown that complemented her coloring beautifully, and her hair had been styled in an elegant chignon that would showcase whatever jewelry she chose. "Tell me," she said to her dresser, "what do you think would look best with this gown?" "The sapphire set would be lovely, Your Majesty. The blue stones would complement the dress perfectly." Camilla nodded absently, but her hand moved toward the case containing the Spencer tiara. She opened it slowly, revealing the diamonds and pearls that had once graced Diana's head. In the soft lighting of her dressing room, the tiara seemed to glow with its own inner light. She picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, substantial in a way that spoke to its quality and craftsmanship. The Spencer family had commissioned this piece from some of the finest jewelers in London, and it showed in every carefully placed stone. "Your Majesty," her dresser prompted gently. Camilla looked at her reflection, holding the tiara near her head but not yet placing it on. She could imagine how it would look, how it would transform her appearance, how it would signal to the world that she was no longer content to live in Diana's shadow. But she could also imagine the headlines, the outrage, the pain it might cause to William and Harry. She could see Charles's disappointment and disapproval, the damage it might do to the carefully maintained dignity of the monarchy. A soft knock on her dressing room door interrupted her internal debate. "Your Majesty," came the voice of her private secretary. "His Majesty would like to speak with you briefly before you join the receiving line." Camilla's heart raced. Had Charles heard about her plans? Had someone warned him about what she might be considering? "Tell him I'll be along shortly," she called back. She looked once more at the Spencer tiara in her hands, then at her reflection in the mirror. The decision she made in the next few minutes would define not just the evening, but potentially her entire reign as queen. It was a moment that would either mark her liberation from Diana's shadow or her descent into controversy and conflict. The tiara caught the light one more time, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls of her dressing room, as if urging her to be brave enough to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Camilla stood frozen in her dressing room, the Spencer tiara cradled in her hands like a precious bird that might take flight at any moment. The diamonds caught every flicker of light from the crystal sconces on the walls, throwing tiny sparkles across her midnight blue gown. She could hear the distant sounds of preparation echoing through the palace corridors, footsteps of staff members making final arrangements, the clink of crystal and china being set for the state dinner, the murmur of early arriving guests being shown to their reception areas. Her dresser waited patiently, hands folded, eyes carefully averted, as if she understood the magnitude of the decision her queen was wrestling with. The weight of the tiara seemed to increase with each passing second, not just its physical weight, but the emotional and historical burden it carried. "Your Majesty," came another gentle knock at the door, followed by the voice of her private secretary. "His Majesty is waiting in the blue drawing room." Charles was waiting. The thought sent a chill through Camilla's spine. She had hoped to make her jewelry choice and appear before him with it already in place, presenting him with a fait accompli that couldn't be argued or reversed. But now she would have to face him with the decision still unmade, the tiara still balanced between possibility and prudence. "Tell His Majesty I'll join him in 5 minutes," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. She looked once more at her reflection, imagining the tiara positioned on her silver hair. In her mind's eye, she could see how regal she would look, how the delicate creation of diamonds and pearls would transform her from Charles's second wife into a queen who commanded attention and respect in her own right. But she could also imagine Diana wearing it, young and radiant on her wedding day, the hope and joy in her eyes as she prepared to join the royal family. The irony wasn't lost on Camilla that she was now in possession of jewelry that had once belonged to a woman who had struggled with many of the same issues she faced: the pressure of public scrutiny, the weight of royal expectations, the challenge of maintaining dignity while living under constant observation. Diana had worn this tiara during some of her happiest moments, but also during times when her marriage was crumbling and her place in the royal family felt uncertain. "Perhaps," Camilla whispered to herself, "that's exactly why I should wear it." She lifted the tiara toward her head, feeling the coolness of the metal against her fingers. Just as she was about to place it on her hair, another knock came at the door, more urgent than the previous ones. "Your Majesty, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you again, but Prince William is on the telephone. He says it's quite urgent and asks if he might speak with you before the evening begins." Camilla's hands trembled slightly, and she nearly dropped the tiara. Prince William calling at this moment couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had told him about her plans, and he was calling to stop her. The future King of England was intervening to protect his mother's memory from what he undoubtedly saw as an inappropriate appropriation. She set the tiara carefully back in its case and walked to her private telephone. Her heart was pounding as she lifted the receiver. "William," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and queenly. "Camilla." His voice was formal, careful, the tone he used when he was trying to control strong emotions. "I understand there may be some question about jewelry choices for this evening's dinner." So he did know. The Palace Gossip Network had worked with its usual efficiency, carrying word of her considerations from her dressing room to the heir to the throne in what couldn't have been more than a few hours. "William, before you say anything, I want you to know that I'm not calling to forbid you from wearing any particular piece. You're the queen now, and those decisions are yours to make." His words surprised her. She had expected anger, demands, perhaps even threats. Instead, his tone was measured, almost gentle. "But," he continued, "I'm calling to ask you to consider the impact of your choice, not just on the family, but on yourself." "What do you mean?" "I mean that my mother's relationship with that tiara and with jewelry in general was complicated. She understood that every choice she made would be scrutinized, analyzed, and turned into headlines. She learned to be very careful about the messages she sent, sometimes at the cost of her own happiness." Camilla sank into the chair beside her telephone table. William's calm approach was more effective than anger would have been. He was appealing to her wisdom rather than trying to control her choices. "William, I hope you understand that I would never do anything to disrespect your mother's memory." "I know that," he said quietly, "but I also know that wearing that particular tiara tonight would inevitably be seen as a statement, and I'm not sure it would be interpreted the way you might hope." "And how do you think it would be interpreted?" There was a pause before William answered, and Camilla could almost hear him choosing his words carefully. "I think it would overshadow everything else about the evening. Instead of people talking about the success of the state dinner or your speech or your work with literacy charities, they would talk about the symbolism of you wearing my mother's tiara. It would become the story." His words hit home because they echoed her own doubts. She wanted to make a statement, but not necessarily to become the only story anyone would remember about the evening. "William," she said finally, "can I ask you something honestly? Do you think she would mind? If she were here, do you think Diana would object to me wearing her tiara?" Another long pause. When William spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. "I think my mother would want you to find your own way of being queen, just as she tried to find her own way of being princess. She understood better than most what it feels like to live under constant comparison and judgment." After she hung up the telephone, Camilla sat in silence for several minutes. William's call had been masterful in its restraint and wisdom. He had managed to dissuade her without commanding her, appealed to her better judgment without attacking her motives. It was the kind of diplomatic skill that would serve him well when he became king. But even as she acknowledged the wisdom of his words, part of her rebelled against them. Why should she have to consider everyone else's feelings and interpretations? Why couldn't she simply wear a beautiful piece of jewelry because she was queen and it belonged to the crown jewels? Another knock at her door brought her back to the immediate reality of the evening ahead. "Your Majesty, His Majesty, is becoming quite concerned about the time. The French president and his wife will be arriving in 20 minutes. Camilla stood up abruptly, decision crystallizing in her mind with sudden clarity. She walked back to her dressing table and opened the case containing the Spencer tiara. The diamond seemed to wink at her in the lamplight, beautiful and tempting and laden with history. "No," she said aloud, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Not tonight." She closed the case and selected instead the sapphire parure that her dresser had suggested earlier. The blue stones were magnificent, complementing her gown perfectly and carrying their own rich history within the royal collection. As her dresser helped fasten the necklace and position the matching tiara, Camilla felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. The sapphire tiara was beautiful, undeniably regal, and completely appropriate for a state dinner. But it was also safe, expected, the kind of choice that would generate no headlines and spark no conversations. It was the choice of a queen who put duty before personal desires, just as and had said she should. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, wearing the sapphires and looking every inch the queen, Camilla made another decision. She would wear the Spencer tiara eventually. Perhaps not tonight, but someday when the moment felt right, when she could make the choice from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. "Your Majesty," her dresser said, stepping back to admire the final result. "You look absolutely magnificent." Camilla smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed all day. She did look magnificent, and more importantly, she felt like herself. Not try to be Diana, not trying to compete with Diana's memory, but simply being Camilla, Queen of England. She made her way through the palace corridors toward the blue drawing room where Charles was waiting. The weight of the sapphire tiara felt comfortable, familiar, while the Spencer tiara remained in its case in her dressing room, waiting for another day, another decision, another moment of courage or wisdom. Charles looked up as she entered the blue drawing room, and his face showed immediate relief. She could see in his expression that he had been worried about what she might choose to wear, and his relief at seeing the sapphires rather than Diana's tiara was obvious. "You look beautiful," he said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek gently. "The sapphires were an excellent choice." "Thank you," she replied, studying his face. "Were you worried about what I might wear tonight?" Charles hesitated, clearly weighing how honest to be. "I was concerned about the pressure you've been under lately. I know it hasn't been easy for you. All the comparisons and speculation. I worried you might make a choice you would later regret. And you think wearing Diana's tiara would have been a choice I'd regret. I think it would have been a choice that would have overshadowed everything else about you and about tonight. You've worked too hard building your own reputation as queen to risk it for the sake of a symbolic gesture." Camilla nodded, understanding that Charles had been protecting her as much as protecting Diana's memory. But she also understood that the conversation about the Spencer tiara was far from over. The issue would return because the deeper question about her place in the royal family, about living in Diana's shadow, about finding her own identity as queen, hadn't been resolved by choosing different jewelry for one evening. "Charles," she said, taking his arm as they prepared to greet their guests, "we need to talk about this more fully. Not tonight, but soon. I need you to understand how difficult it's been for me, always feeling like I'm being compared to her." "I know," he said quietly, "and I want to help. But tonight, let's focus on representing our country with dignity and grace. The rest can wait until tomorrow." As they walked toward the grand staircase where they would receive the French president and his wife, Camilla caught a glimpse of herself in one of the massive mirrors that lined the corridor. She looked regal, confident, every inch a queen. The sapphires sparkled magnificently, and her posture was straight and proud. But in the back of her mind, she could still see the Spencer tiara in its case, waiting patiently for the day when she would be brave enough or foolish enough to claim it. That day would come, she was certain. The only question was when, and whether she would be ready for the consequences when it did. The sound of approaching cars in the palace courtyard announced the arrival of their guests, and Camilla straightened her shoulders, preparing to play her role as queen with all the grace and dignity the position demanded. Tonight, she would be everything Charles needed her to be, everything the country expected her to be. But tomorrow, the Spencer tiara would still be there, still calling to her, still representing everything she longed for and everything she feared about claiming her full place in royal history. The state dinner proceeded with a flawless precision that had made British royal entertaining legendary throughout the world. Camilla played her role as queen consort perfectly, charming the French president's wife with her knowledge of French literature, engaging in thoughtful conversation about educational initiatives across Europe, and ensuring that every guest felt welcomed and honored. The sapphires she wore caught the light magnificently under the crystal chandeliers of the palace ballroom, and more than one observer commented on how regal and confident she appeared. But despite the evening's success, Camilla found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the Spencer tiara sitting in its case upstairs. Even as she smiled and conversed and fulfilled every obligation of her royal role, part of her mind remained fixed on that decision she hadn't quite made, that statement she hadn't quite been brave enough to deliver. The irony wasn't lost on her that in choosing the safe option, the diplomatic option, she had proven Anne's point about putting duty before personal desires. She had been the perfect queen consort for the evening, but she had also remained invisible in the way she had grown to resent. Tomorrow's headlines would focus on the successful diplomacy, the beautiful gowns, the grandeur of the palace. No one would remember Camilla specifically, because she had chosen to blend into the expected role rather than stand out from it. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Camilla found herself alone in her private sitting room, still wearing the sapphire tiara, but feeling oddly deflated by the evening's success. Charles had retired to his study to review briefing papers for the next day's meetings, leaving her with her thoughts and the weight of a decision deferred. Lady Susan appeared in the doorway, carrying the jewelry cases that would need to be returned to the vault. "A magnificent evening, Your Majesty," Susan said, beginning to gather the jewelry boxes scattered across Camilla's dressing table. The French delegation seemed genuinely impressed with the hospitality. "Yes," Camilla replied absently. "I suppose it went well." Susan paused in her tidying, sensing something in Camilla's tone. "Your Majesty, you seem troubled. Is everything all right?" Camilla looked at her most trusted lady-in-waiting, this woman who had served the royal family with such dedication and discretion for so many years. If anyone would understand the complex emotion she was wrestling with, it would be Susan. "Susan, may I ask you something? When you were serving Queen Elizabeth, did she ever struggle with living up to expectations? Did she ever feel overshadowed by those who came before her?" Susan set down the jewelry case she was holding and gave Camilla her full attention. "Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth struggled with many things, especially in her early years. She was very young when she became queen, and she often felt inadequate compared to the royal women who had preceded her. She particularly felt the weight of comparison to her mother, the Queen Mother, who was beloved by the public. But she found her way eventually. She did, but it took time, and she learned that trying to be someone else, try to live up to someone else's legacy, was less effective than finding her own strengths and building on them." Camilla fingered the sapphire necklace she was still wearing. "But what if your own strengths are never enough? What if people will always prefer the memory of someone else? Your Majesty, with respect, I think you may be underestimating the impact you've had. Yes, you will always be compared to Princess Diana. That's unavoidable. But you've also carved out your own space, your own contributions. Your work with literacy, your support for domestic violence survivors, your dedication to the Commonwealth. These things matter, regardless of what jewelry you wear." Susan's words were kind, but they didn't address the deeper frustration Camilla felt. She wasn't seeking validation for her charitable work or her dedication to duty. She was seeking something more fundamental: the right to exist as queen without constantly justifying her presence or tiptoeing around the memory of her predecessor. After Susan left, Camilla remained in her sitting room, still in her evening gown and sapphires, staring out at the palace gardens where security lights cast long shadows across the carefully maintained lawns. The autumn night was clear, with stars visible despite the glow of London's lights, and she found herself thinking about Diana, wondering what the late princess would think of the evening's drama. Would Diana have understood Camilla's desire to wear the Spencer tiara? Would she have seen it as an act of disrespect or as a natural evolution of royal tradition? Diana had, after all, been known for her own bold choices, her willingness to break with tradition when she felt it served a greater purpose. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. She expected to see Susan returning with some forgotten item, but instead, Charles appeared in the doorway, having changed from his formal evening wear into a comfortable dressing gown. "May I join you?" he asked. Camilla nodded, and Charles settled into the chair across from her. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, both processing the events of the evening and the larger questions that lay beneath them. "You did beautifully tonight," Charles said finally. The French president mentioned specifically how impressed his wife was with your conversation about educational policy. Thank you, Camilla replied, though I suspect we both know that's not really what tonight was about. Charles leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's face in the soft lamplight. Camilla, I know this has been difficult for you. I know you feel like you're constantly being compared to Diana, and I know that's not fair, but it's the reality we live with. Yes, it's the reality we live with. But wearing her tiara tonight wouldn't have changed that reality. It would have only made it more complicated. Camilla finally turned to look directly at her husband. Charles, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Do you think I'll ever step out of her shadow? Do you think there will ever come a time when people see me as Queen Camilla, not as the woman who replaced Diana? Charles was quiet for a long time, clearly weighing his words carefully. I think, he said finally, that people's perceptions change slowly over time. I think your legacy will be built on your actions, your dedication, your service, not on symbolic gestures or attempt to claim pieces of someone else's history. But what if I want to claim pieces of that history? What if I believe I have a right to them? Then, you need to ask yourself whether claiming them will serve your goals or work against them. Tonight, I think wearing Diana's tiara would have worked against your goals. It would have overshadowed everything else you've accomplished and reduced you to a footnote in her story rather than establishing your own story. Camilla understood the wisdom in Charles's words, but they didn't satisfy the deeper longing she felt. She wanted to be more than a footnote in anyone's story. She wanted to be seen as a queen who had earned her place through her own merits, not someone who was constantly having to prove she deserved to be there. Charles, she said finally, I'm going to wear that tiara someday. He looked at her with surprise and something that might have been concern. Camilla, not tomorrow, and probably not next year, but someday when the moment is right, when I can do it from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. I need to know that I have that choice, that I'm not forever constrained by other people's sensitivities about Diana's memory. Charles nodded slowly. If that day comes, I hope you'll discuss it with me first. Not because I want to control your choices, but because I want to make sure we're thinking through all the implications together. I will, Camilla promised. But I also need you to understand that this isn't just about a piece of jewelry. It's about my right to exist as queen without constantly deferring to the ghost of your first wife. I do understand that, Charles said quietly, and I want to help you find ways to establish your own identity as queen. But I also need you to understand that some battles aren't worth fighting, and some victories come at too high a cost. Later that night, as Camilla finally prepared for bed, she stood once more before the case containing the Spencer tiara. She opened it and lifted the delicate creation of diamonds and pearls, holding it up to catch the light from her bedside lamp. It was beautiful, undeniably beautiful, and in the right light at the right angle, she could imagine how magnificent she would look wearing it. But she could also imagine the aftermath, the headlines, the speculation, the renewed focus on her relationship with Diana's memory rather than on her own accomplishments. She could see William's disappointment, Anne's frustration, and Charles's worry. She could picture the editorial writers having a field day, the social media commentary, the endless analysis of what her choice had meant and what it said about her character. For now, the cost was too high. The statement she wanted to make would be lost in the controversy it would generate. But that didn't mean she was abandoning the idea entirely. She was simply choosing her moment more carefully. She placed the tiara back in its case and closed the lid gently. Someday, she promised herself, when she was more secure in her role, when the public had accepted her more fully as queen, when wearing it would be seen as confidence rather than presumption. Someday, she would wear Diana's tiara, and she would wear it with pride and without apology. But tonight wasn't that night. Tonight had been about proving that she could be a successful queen consort, that she could fulfill the role with grace and dignity and skill. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to establish her identity and build her legacy. As she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Camilla reflected on the evening's events. She had chosen duty over desire, wisdom over impulse, diplomacy over drama. These weren't the choices of a weak woman or a woman living in someone else's shadow. They were the choices of a queen who understood her responsibilities and was learning to navigate the complex demands of her position. The Spencer tiara would wait. It had waited 27 years since Diana's death, and it could wait longer. But when the right moment came, when Camilla was ready to claim her full place in royal history, it would be there, beautiful, symbolic, and finally hers to wear without apology or explanation. Until then, she would build her own legacy, make her own mark, and prove to herself and to the world that Queen Camilla was not a pale imitation of anyone who had come before, but a monarch in her own right, with her own strengths, her own contributions, and her own rightful place in the long history of the British crown. The decision about the tiara had been deferred, but not abandoned. And in that deferral lay not defeat, but the patience and wisdom that would ultimately make her worthy of wearing it when the time was finally right.